Welcome to this webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide you with a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a taskbar with icons. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. After the webinar is over, please take our survey to tell us how we've done. Throughout the presentation, you can network with others or submit questions to the speakers in the box next to the slides. Download resources from the folder icon. Today's event is being recorded and archived and will be available within 24 hours. For on-demand questions or comments, send us an email by clicking Email Us. If you experience any technical issues today, please refresh your browser by hitting F5 for a PC or Command R for Macs, or email webinars@bmpmedia.com for one-on-one support. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's moderator.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Safety and Security Panel webinar, Protecting Facilities and Lone Workers. This event, brought to you by Security, is sponsored by Everbridge. I'm your moderator, Claire Meyer, Managing Editor of Security. Thanks for joining us. Today's panelists are Alan Borntrager, Steve Cremando, and Imad Moulin. Alan Borntrager leads the security at Red Hat. He brings 28 years of military law enforcement, investigative, security, and life safety experience in varied entities and corporations, cultures, geographies, and threat environments, aiding in the possession of an international mindset. In 2014, Alan joined Red Hat as the head of global security, safety, and business resilience, with responsibilities for enterprise-wide security risk management and business resiliency matters. Steve Cremando is a subject matter expert and trainer specialized in human factors and behavioral science in homeland and corporate security, anti-terrorism, violence prevention and intervention, and emergency and disaster management. Steve is a board-certified expert in traumatic stress and certified trauma specialist. He holds diplomate status with the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress and the National Center for Crisis Management. He has been awarded Level 5 certification in Homeland Security. He is recognized as an expert in the behavioral response to CBRN emergencies and mass violence. Steve is the Director of Training for the Disaster and Terrorism Branch in the New Jersey Department of Human Services, Division of Mental Health Services, as well as the founder and principal in Behavioral Science Applications, an innovative operational risk management consultancy serving a global client base. Imad Moulin currently serves as Chief Technology Officer for Everbridge and General Manager of Everbridge's Critical Event Management Platform. He has been with Everbridge for over 6 years and was an instrumental part in helping the organization grow to what it is today and becoming the first to go public in its space. Prior to Everbridge, he has worked for many organizations, including Cloudflare, CompuWare, Gomez, and S1. Moderating the panel today is Michael Scott of Everbridge. Don't forget to submit your questions, and later on in the program, our presenters will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's panel moderator, Michael Scott.
Thank you, Claire. With that said, we're going to jump into the discussion. We are going to be covering 3 topic areas for this panel. They include behavioral, strategies and planning, and technology. And then we'll wrap it up with one additional discussion point to bring all 3 together. Let's get started. So our first question is going to be, Steve, I'm going to kick it off to you. Risk perception plays a significant role in how employers and employees anticipate and prepare for risk related to business travel and remote or lone work. How can both parties ensure that they are in the right mindset to address these risks in these settings?
Well, Michael, thanks for starting with the question. And I'll tell you, there's an interesting model that we use in the behavioral sciences. This known as the extended parallel process model. And it goes like this very quickly. it says that we get the best result in terms of behavioral change. And here we'll be understanding that to mean safety, concerns about safety and the right safety practices when we do two things. And the first is when the employer communicates with the employee. And think about what this means in business travel or loan work or a number of different settings. Communicates two things with the employee. And the first is that the types and the susceptibility of different sorts of risks to let employees know in these different places that they're working really what those risks are. So that means that the organization needs to do their due diligence and have different intelligence sources in place to learn about those risks. But they need to share those risks, because if employees feel that they're not particularly susceptible, this doesn't apply to me, we don't get the desired behavioral change. The second part of that from the employer standpoint is to communicate in kind of a non-terrifying way the severity of the risk. Because even if the employee understands they may be susceptible to certain risks in their work, they're not likely to change their behavior to protect themselves or change their safety posture unless they understand both the susceptibility and the severity. But the next part is actually the most important, and that we refer to that in general as confidence. And that means when the employee has confidence that they know what to do to respond to those different risks, and that typically means training for us and clarity in the policy and the procedures of the organization. But when they have confidence in what to do, and they also have confidence that the organization is in a state of readiness to respond to a risk or a crisis as well, when we've checked those four boxes, we get the desired behavioral change and we move people to do their part. And of course, we're always looking at safety and security as a blended solution of technologies and safety practices, and we need the employer and employee to be on board with those concepts to help move the needle and get people in the right frame of mind to perceive risk and also respond to risk appropriately.
Thank you, Steve. I'll open it up now to the other two panelists. Imad or Alan, do you have anything to add?
This is Alan. Thank you for the introduction, and Steve, could not agree with you more. Just a tiny bit of context to reinforce, I guess, my perspective and or where I'm coming from an organizational perspective. The median age of the associates that are employed by Red Hat is 29 years old. We have 99 offices, 37 countries. Half of our employees, or almost half of our employees, work your way. So they may be remotees, they may be very diffused or decentralized, I guess, from from a context perspective. So to Steve's point, we have to explain in many cases the reason why that we're approaching risk mitigation strategies and the risks that exist, and certainly kind of jointly designing those risk mitigation strategies to achieve greater commitment. We talk about at Red Hat, because we're an open source software company, the open decision-making framework. So a lot of that is explaining, again, the reasons why with eliminating plausible deniability through providing data. So what are the risks that are out there? Not from a nanny state or a fear, uncertainty, and doubt perspective, but more from, hey, this is what our duty of care is from an organizational perspective. These are the legal tenets for whether it's a duty to warn or the regulatory requirements associated with things like corporate manslaughter or corporate homicide acts. But it's also a duty for care. Like, we do genuinely care for our associates, and that there's an employee and employer responsibility for that. And a lot of that, at least from our perspective, is from a risk perception perspective, is working in partnership with other business units. So whether that's legal from a compliance perspective, or our HR team, which we call our people team, from a kind of a competitive differentiator in that war for talent, to say, hey, look, in order for us to reduce the risks to employees, we need to prepare you, and whether that's, again, from a business travel perspective or from a remotee perspective, the large proportion of our organization is remote and very diffuse. So they need to understand that we're here to assist with and jointly design what those risk mitigation strategies are.
If I can add one quick thing to that. One part of the question I would like to maybe highlight or underline is mindset. As Alan mentioned, the whole idea of the duty of care is certainly one thing. Being able to have a common understanding from the part of the employer and the employee as to what each party's responsibility is absolutely key. But in many cases, when you're dealing with your employees and an employer, I think it is worthwhile to remember that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. Now, you'll need to find a way to scale all of your processes and training, etc. But in many cases, the skill sets, the mindset of the employee might be different. So sending a 29-year-old, as you said, who's actually never been abroad on a business trip may require a slightly different set of thinking or thoughts across the board. If somebody's traveling regionally and speaks the language and is familiar with the culture and the mores, there may be a slightly different mindset than one who's going abroad for the first time on company business. Unfortunately, I think the perspective from the employer doesn't change. You still have the same duty of care, but your risk perception in this case is going to be slightly different and needs to be tailored appropriately. So when making a decision, for example, as to whether to send somebody out on a job or a business trip somewhere, the idea behind understanding what that traveler is capable of and what their experience is can have an impact as to whether they should be going there or not in the first place.
Thank you. So let's move on to the next question. Thank you to all our panelists for their responses. The next question, Steve, you can kick this one off as well. There are so many different types of risks that may affect travelers and remote workers. With that said, are there any approaches to mitigating risks that cut across the entire spectrum of hazards these workers may face?
Well, I think part of that, Mike, ties back to the last comment about mindset, and also kind of the uniqueness of assessing both the risk and the person in that. Part of duty to care is the employer having knowledge about those hazards, but also about knowing, what that person's capable of. Do they have any special requirements or special vulnerabilities? I think that it goes back to the original question and the mindset issue with that concept that this is a shared obligation, that safety, security, and risk mitigation are shared obligations between the employer and the employee. And employers need to continue, and this is tricky, and employees as well, to look for ways that even though someone may be off-site or working in a very remote location, not only is communication ongoing, and not just during crisis scenarios, but almost daily communication, is the idea that the risk environment is ever changing, and that person on the ground and in the environment also is the eyes and ears. So I think that the strategy, Michael, rather than a silver bullet, is this kind of two-way responsibility that employee on the ground, wherever they are eyes and ears, that they are going to be some of the best detectors of risk, and our solutions need to be done, and this went back a moment ago to the earlier comment, done with the employee rather than done to the employee. So there are probably some strategies, but I'd be hard-pressed to list right now beyond, conference calls, video chats, things where we're having face-to-face contact with the person, a number of different techniques. Now, I just want to add one thing to that, and it gets left off the equation sometimes. With those remote workers, especially with a young workforce, it is very good to have those check-ins and to have them visually as well, because the person's physical and mental health can change when they're isolated, when they're away, especially if they're away for one of the first times. So there's a number of different approaches, but it comes back, I think, to a shared ownership of those risks, and strategies, I believe, flow out of that.
Thank you, Steve. I'll open it up now to our two other panelists. Alan or Imad, do you have anything to add?
This is Alan. I guess I'll throw in the mix, and I think, again, Steve certainly is dovetailing very well in with the previous conversation or question, which is we look at it from a kind of an all hazards risk assessment, whether it's a natural, a man-made, or even a technical disaster. How are we doing that risk assessment? And, again, eliminating that plausible deniability in many cases. So whether it's a higher risk location or a higher risk activity, you can talk about hazmat or heights or enclosed spaces from a kind of a life safety perspective, but you can also talk a lot about, the medical exposure or violence or whatever the case may be. Regardless of the kind of the risk assessment component, reducing unsafe behaviors or identifying the causes of those unsafe behaviors requires the participation and involvement of the individual associate or employee. And the only way we can do it, which is, again, I think what Steve was alluding to or being very pointed about, was that we as organizational leaders have to be visible and approachable and available. And whether that's, whatever that communication medium may be, informal group chats using technology or whatever the employee perspective we can get as to how this is going to help them is critically important for us to be able to move forward with what the risks exist and how can we mitigate those risks across all the spectrums, again, whether it's natural, man-made, or even technical. And not to spend a whole lot of time on this, I think we probably will chat about this a little further in the technology component, but the staff monitoring portion, we struggle as an organization not to be intrusive, not to be nanny state or big brother, but at the same time understanding that we have an obligation and responsibility to help know where our associates are and how they're impacted by any one of those risks that may exist across the board.
And to add to that, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in the planning and maybe in the technology piece. But to me, it comes down to really a couple of simple philosophies. Now, the execution a little bit tougher than simply the philosophies themselves. Now, number one, do you have a good idea as to where your people, your assets are? On the one hand, and when they're moving, that gets to be a little bit difficult, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. On the other hand, do you have and can you keep track of all of the appropriate risk events that, again, your assets or your people might come in contact with? And as Alan said, they could be natural or man-made or even IT-related. And the trick here is to ensure that as you're tracking, on the one hand, the things that are most valuable, your people, your assets, and on the other hand, the things that might actually harm them, that when there is an intersection, that you have ultimately some type of process that can get kicked off, that you have a good idea and a way to assess the severity of these risk events, the urgency of these risk events, the certainty of these risk events, and based on a combination of all three, make a determination of how you're going to mitigate that risk, for example. Is this the type of risk that is going to cause you to stop a trip from happening? Or if a trip is already underway, ask the person to come back at this point in time. Or take some steps to ensure that they're keeping an eye on the situation and are checking in more frequently, and they're ready, for example, to get to safety if needed. Again, having a good understanding of that situation, a good awareness of that situation, and keeping an eye on that severity, that urgency, that certainty allows you to have an appropriate approach towards mitigating these risks without unduly impacting the business and the mission.
You know, before we move away from that, I want to dovetail on that for a moment. When we speak often to our clients about a formula or an approach in terms of situational awareness, we always stress the importance of situational awareness containing the 2 R's of risks and resources. And so going back to the last comment, really, how are we making sure that our associates, one, understand the risks, you know, their severity, their dynamic nature, but also what's available to them to counter those risks? What are thresholds for engaging different resources and such? Now, I'm just mentioning this from the behavioral science standpoint, that again, we tend to get the best result in terms of desired behavior, behavioral change, when we speak about situational awareness through those filters of both risk and resource.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the last question of the behavioral section. So we broke this out into 2 parts. So Steve, I'll kick it off to you as well. And the question reads as, will any sectors or industries be more affected by significant risk increases to traveling remote workers? And as a second part to that, what can be done proactively to help employers and employees stay ahead of the curve?
Well, you know, that's a big question, and we can go into many different sectors, but I'd like to isolate on one that I believe is common sense. There is a growing trend towards community-based and home-based healthcare. We know that in the healthcare sector, that hospital, healthcare, and human service workers are assaulted at 4 times the risk or the rate of almost any other kind of employee in the United States. So when you kind of bring these 2 concepts together, that we're going to have, with our aging population, a greater need for home-based, community-based, field-based healthcare, we have more and more people providing that hands-on care without the benefit of, you know, the security force that may be at a hospital or coworkers available to assist if something goes wrong. I see that as a very, very high-risk tool. And there's a number of forces and part of the culture of healthcare that kind of works against that sometimes, but there's also been a lot of good work done by their professional associations trying to reduce violence against healthcare workers in general, but here, as they move, as an emerging sector, moving ever more into the field, the need for them to have both good skills in verbal de-escalation, in early recognition of things like aggression or other risks. And you have to remember that that risk might not just be from their patient or client. It could be from someone who's on the street as they're approaching the home, or someone else who's in that neighborhood or that home or apartment building. So we're putting people in that sector increasingly out into field settings where I think the risk is going to change exponentially, and the need for that blended solution again of skills to handle those risks and technologies to put at their fingertips will be absolutely critical, because they're not necessarily going to have security or other assets with them.
Thank you, Steve. I'll pass that over to Alan and Imad. Any thoughts?
I think Steve's probably got the best pulse from a sector perspective. I'll just kind of throw in the mix that each individual that is responsible for, again, the life safety and security of their individual associates and invitees needs to look at it from, again, what are those examples of hazards or risks that may be encountered by those distributed workers, whether it's handling cash or working from home or machinery or hazmat or even overseas locations, which probably is applicable to many of the organizations. So I think, you know, Steve is spot on from that perspective. I would like to kind of unravel a tiny bit on the proactive component. That may be the greatest challenge for the safety, security, business resilience profession. Right now, the kind of over-the-horizons risk, or the you know, what are those emerging risks, and how are they impacting each individual enterprise or entity is the greatest challenge for us, because it's how do we tell what's happening from a future perspective, or where is it coming from, and what do we need to do to mitigate those risks? And unfortunately, I think right now we have an asymmetric risk topology across the world, and we can chat about that probably in some of the other sectors or other sections of this conversation. But I think from my perspective, if you're looking to be proactive, even though that's probably the lowest on the maturity level for us as an industry, as a security industry, if you can tie it to 10Ks, the SEC filings in the U.S. for similar industries, or you look at the World Economic Forum and what they see as emerging risks, or even paid entities like the Corporate Executive Board, and what do they see as the individual risks that are negatively impacting organizations across the board. I think that's very helpful in us trying to look at, okay, what's getting ready to occur, and how is that going to potentially impact our individual enterprises? So I think it's, again, a couple-fold. One is the hazards and risks encountered by those distributed workers are very culturally specific. And then from a proactive perspective, try to tie into what the rest of the industry in your sector is doing, what, again, you're seeing from a global perspective, and from, again, paid services like Corporate Executive Board or other associations.
So why don't I just follow up with one quick thing? If I may take a slightly more prosaic interpretation of the second question, especially around the proactive nature of it. So Alan, from your perspective, I think the proactive nature was really more of a broader level analysis of potentially the situation. I'm looking at it in a way that's somewhat more day-to-day and practical. So for example, if you are going to have these healthcare workers, as Steve mentioned, or these other distributed workers across the board, is there a way to help them keep safe proactively? So for example, we talked about, hey, let them check in, let travelers or lone workers check in more frequently, for example. Steve was mentioning even face-to-face conversations, etc. But is there a way to reverse it a little bit and say, have a capability or a system that will automatically and proactively react if they do not check in? If when they're on assignment, for example, to check in on a patient, that if they do not check in within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that an alert will go out to the people who are in your security operations center with the appropriate location, for example, of that worker, and then triggering a particular process that's well understood and well planned ahead of time, and ultimately that has been that has gone through exercises and drills, etc. That's the sort of thing that may help with a more proactive approach towards keeping employees safe, but at the same time, it can also help employees do their jobs better, knowing that ultimately, whether it's the system or the processes or their fellow employees, have their back.
Ahmad, I think this is Alan. Ahmad, I think you're spot on. I mean, again, my response was more from a strategic perspective, but from a transactional or tactical perspective, and the genuine care for employees, the duty of care, duty for care for employees, and those, I guess, foundational components, if you will, of making sure that folks feel safe to do their jobs regardless of where they are in the world, I think is a critically important differentiator, and I appreciate you highlighting that one.
Thank you. So at this time, we're going to move to the second part of our panel discussion. We're going to cover different topics related to strategies and planning for lone worker facility security. So Alan, I'll have you kick this part of the discussion off with our first question. How does a global organization that has employees traveling through many countries some that are not entirely stable, able to ensure their employees are safe?
Well, I'll start first with the response that I'm not sure that there is a quote-unquote insurer. I think there's only the reduction of risk. And unfortunately and I think I used this terminology a little earlier in one of the responses, is that right now there is an asymmetric risk, that there's a risk that exists regardless of where our associates are. I know we talked a little bit earlier about the 29-year-old traveling. So I'm as concerned about the 29-year-old who, frankly, has never traveled from his home in California to Atlanta, Georgia, as I am the very seasoned traveler who's going to Egypt, as an example, or a higher risk location. So, whether you talk about Boston or San Bernardino from a terrorism perspective, or Latin America being home to 8% of the world's population, but a third of the homicides, or India having crimes against women from a sexual assaults or a rapes perspective, each one of those components, I guess from our perspective, is that, again, we're trying to provide the data to eliminate plausible deniability. Hey, look, it never happens to us, or we're with Red Hat, or I've never seen that kind of risk. We've got to at least inform our associates that this is what the potential risks are, whether it's, again, a medical or a geopolitical or a terrorism or a security perspective, and allow them the opportunity to understand that you have to put your own measures in place. So what are those kind of victim avoidance techniques? But also giving them the data to say, hey, look, in order for me to reduce this risk, this is what we need to be aware of, kind of the know before you go, for lack of the better term.
Thank you, Alan. So I'll open it up now to our other two panelists, Steve and Iman.
Well, I'll jump in for 1 second, and certainly I think that concept is right about the inability to absolutely ensure or guarantee safety. So, we come back to this word about mitigation, and mitigation, by its classic definition, are what are the things we would do to reduce the likelihood of the event or the severity of the event if it happens. And, as I think about that, I think about a number of risks, and I'm as an example right now thinking of something like this big uptick we've had in vehicular assaults, and we've had the majority of those in Europe. We've done a really good job for the last decade, sadly, teaching people strategies for active shooter response. Whether your organization has subscribed to run, hide, fight sorts of approaches, or alert, or ALICE, or some other methodology, we've said these things happen, they happen all over, and here are your options and skills for reducing your likelihood of being a victim and such. But there's a whole bunch of other risks, and just as a general strategy in which we need to be able to say to the employees, we're going into country X, or you're going to city Y, and in these places, here's the risk profile. That's important to raise awareness of that, but the other part of that solution is very skill-based. Should you be confronted with a vehicular terror attack, you're out at a tourist spot, you're out at a popular part of the city, and you hear those squealing tires, what's the suggested response to reduce injury and improve survivability? So I think, although I'm using this very narrow example of vehicular attack, that mitigation concept, I think it ties directly back to where Alan was coming from, is we cannot ensure, we can reduce. And if we use that concept of mitigation, reduce likelihood of the event, reduce severity of the event, I think that's our best approach.
And to add to that, I think if you do have a situation that happens, such as the one that Steve's describing, so whether it's Barcelona or London, what you want to know as quickly as possible is, again, do you have people who are at risk? And in that particular case, you want to know as quickly as possible. Do I have people who live there, work there, have visited the building there, are on their way there across the board? And they could be employees, they could be expats, they could be visitors, they could be travelers. you may want to send out an accountability message to everybody as quickly as possible to understand, again, who's safe and who's not, and ultimately after that, how that may impact your organization across the board. But your strategy with dealing with that might be different for what may be called local nationals versus expats versus business travelers versus people who happen to be there on their own personal time. Again, you may still have a duty of care, but your response and ultimately the workflow you'll kick off may need to be different based on the specific situation in that case.
So I'm wondering if part of a solution actually draws, Ahmad, both on yours and Alan's concepts, which is on the front side, employees are going into the field with very good intelligence about the nature of their risk, the locations and such. And on the other side of that is during the event and the immediate post-event, very good, clear communication and accountability, good messaging to them about what to do. Do we increasingly look for ways to blend that as people are getting intelligence information or even in real time being pinged about accountability, that there can be messages embedded in that, do these things. Here are some basic steps to improve your safety as the incident is kind of unfolding. So I think all of these things start to meld together into a more unified approach in which we probably get our best approach. When we start to take down silos and make sure that the things that the three of us are speaking about, the intelligence piece, the behavior of people, and the technologies to empower that, the more these things integrate, I think the better we do for everyone.
Agreed.
Thank you. So our next question, Ahmad, I'll have you kick this one off. Companies should be prepared for a major incident through practice. With that said, to what extent should they prepare for an incident in terms of tabletop exercises, live drills, or company-wide exercises?
In my view, we can never be really too prepared. Actually, as a matter of fact, I see it on both ends of the spectrum. Things that are incredibly important from a best practice perspective, first and foremost, is to ensure that you are prepared. So yeah, whether it's tabletop exercises or live drills or whatnot, but also with after-action reviews, after the fact. Hopefully, all of you who've dealt with Irma or Harvey or anything else and are in the recovery phase are going through some type of an overall AAR. What did we do well? What did we not do well? And then ultimately, as you're changing either your procedures, your processes, your SOPs, your EOPs, that you're incorporating those into your next set of drills to ensure that any bottlenecks have been dealt with. Again, on a more practical basis, the ability to have company-wide exercises on a regular basis, quarterly, for example, are absolutely crucial. So, for example, do you know that you can actually reach everyone when you need to reach everyone? And it's amazing that you may think, yeah, what's the big deal? Of course I can. But well, you'd be surprised. I mean, do you have the right contact information about every employee? Do you have the appropriate metadata, for example, that tells you whether they are local nationals or they are expats or they are travelers? Do you have information, for example, that tell you whether they are traveling to a particular country, and is that all integrated with their profile right then and there? You'd be surprised. Do you have their cell phone numbers? Do you have their right email address across the board? If they have special needs, do you have that information in there, right, across the board? For example, if somebody is traveling and they are power dependent or they have special medical needs, is that in their profile, whether that's part of an HR database or more likely something that is self-reported appropriately, because that may need you to kick off a different type of process or protocol when they happen to be in harm's way, whether, again, that's due to a terrorist attack or simply because they're going to be stranded because of Mother Nature. So being able to have those exercises, again, whether they're tabletop or whether you're simply unannounced to the entire company, sending out an employee accountability notification and ensuring that you're getting the appropriate type of response within a reasonable amount of time and you can then follow up is absolutely key to show you your readiness, right? And that's the team that's actually conducting these exercises that ultimately would be doing it in real life, as well as the rest of the organization. Do they know who these messages are coming from? Do they know how to respond? Do they know that, for example, their information is going to be safe and secure and their privacy respected? Otherwise, when the real thing happens, you may not have the best results.
Steve or Alan, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'll jump in for a minute. I have a different perspective. So two statements, and then I'll build on it. And the first is that during crisis situations, people don't rise to the occasion. They fall to their training. And we kind of back that up with the idea that practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. We have to do things with behavioral kind of reality. You know, it is one set, and I'm going to use a scenario here as kind of an example. It's one thing to say to employees, you know, you're in country X and there's a higher risk of kidnapping or things of this nature. So if you were ever kidnapped or carjacked, here's the things to do. Now, first of all, those are really, really hard to do in tabletop exercises and in drills and so forth. But they become important. And, you know, there's another aspect we haven't discussed. It's embedded in everything the three of us are saying, which is, you know, safety, security, but also defensibility. And the question becomes, you know, did you have systems in place? Yes, we did. Did you train employees in these things? Yes, we did. And the question then is, well, how do you know they could actually execute that? And that comes back to things like, you know, well, we did training with them and exercises with them and so forth. But some of these exercises or some of the risk scenarios are very difficult to do drills around, and some are very frightening. And so, for example, you have a lot of pushback in organizations around even having discussions about active shooter, never mind having an active shooter drill. When you think about something like, you know, what would an employee's recommended behavior be during a carjacking or a kidnapping, and here, Alan, you used the term before about things over the horizon. I'm really excited about a day, and I don't know when that is, when there may be even more virtual reality kind of trainings in which we could have people in scenarios that actually do allow them to experience some of the emotion. Because the thing that's difficult for us to calculate is, you know, not does the employee know the action steps, do they just have technologies at their fingertips to empower them, but under acute stress and fear, can they execute those things? And one of the best ways to do that, of course, is with test drills and exercises. And I'm thinking down the road, because I think about something simple like training law enforcement officers with simunitions or on digital sort of shooting ranges. It does create that kind of fear response so the person can see how they would react under different risk scenarios. So from a behavioral science standpoint, that's something that's really interesting and kind of really exciting for me out somewhere on the horizon as more of our exercises being in those virtual environments that can provoke an emotional response.
This is Alan. I'm going to pull the string a tiny bit about Steve's observation, and you know, I'm going to make it a little overly simplified as it relates to kind of the, I guess, corporate security, safety, and business resilience world. I've seen kind of two different schools of thought. One is creating the pain, if you will. Hey, look, if you don't understand how to respond to these kinds of critical incidents, then this is I guess the desperation or the fear, if you will, if you're not prepared and you don't understand what the plan is. And the other one is more of a build confidence. So you start foundationally, what are the predecessors or what are the prerequisites, for lack of a better term, from one level to the next. And I think you're headed the right direction by talking about okay, how do we orient folks to thinking in that mindset? And then how do we do tabletops associated with their individual responsibilities? And then how do we expand that to functional exercises and then cross-functional exercises? And then it ultimately becomes a large-scale test or exercise. And I think, at least the success that I've seen is more the latter rather than the former. So building confidence and allowing folks to say, hey, look, I understand now what this plan is all about and the why behind it, the rationale for why we're creating this, and then building confidence as time goes on rather than unleashing the bugbear, if you will, of, hey, look, we're going to do an overall enterprise-wide exercise, and we're going to watch folks fail so they feel some pain and understand what the criticality of us doing this kind of exercises or drills. At least from my perspective, major incident response through practice works most successfully if you help folks build confidence in the why behind it, and then I guess again the prerequisites for each level. Again, whether it's orientation to the plans, the tabletops, the exercises, cross-functional or functional, or the large-scale enterprise-wide testing.
Thank you, Alan. So at this time, I'm going to jump ahead to our technology portion. If we have some time at the end, I will go back to one of the questions that we're going to skip over. Okay. So this first question, Alan, if you don't mind taking the first stab at it. Many major organizations can have employees geographically dispersed, whether remote or traveling. How can organizations stay ahead of issues and warn employees of potential risks? And again, this is in regard to technologies.
So I'll caveat, but even before I hop into the technologies component, I think relationships and creating those relationships for sources are as critically important as the actual solution itself. I had a chief technology officer at a previous organization tell me that IT solutions, frankly, don't make us smarter, they make us stupider faster if we don't have the processes in place beforehand. So a little tongue-in-cheek there, but from my perspective, start with the relationships for sources to be able to identify, again, what are those risks and what are the issues and how do we warn our associates. From my perspective, it's multifaceted. We're not going to rely on a single source of information. We're going to use paid services, whether it's security intelligence services or travel risk related, travel risk mitigation services. We do a lot, frankly, to full disclosure, on social media scrubbing. So what are we seeing as trending? Just a character example is that we saw for those that kind of followed the terrorist attack or the shooting attack that occurred in the Fort Lauderdale airport several months ago, 20 minutes before it showed up either on open media or one of our paid services, it showed up on a social media source that there was an active shooter in that location. So it got us running much faster than what we anticipated otherwise. So again, we look at paid services, we look at social media scrubbing, we look at open media, we look at law enforcement intelligence. Just to put a tiny plug in, particularly for those that are operating overseas, is the Overseas Security Advisory Council, or OSAC, that falls under the Department of State for the U.S. Department of State Department. It is a fantastic organization and certainly allows us to look at what are those risks and how do we reduce those risks to operate in other countries besides the U.S. So I think from my perspective, how do we look at those issues and how do we warn those issues? It's multifaceted. It's not singular in nature. It's where are those sources and how do we warn them as quickly as possible, because data intelligence frankly provides little to limited in value.
Let me take again, hopefully give a complementary answer to that. To me, again, if I were to take a step back in an organization that you're really what you're looking to do is ensuring that you're tracking really 5 things across the board that you care about. Number one, hopefully that's number one for everybody, it's your people. And again, whether they're your employees or your contractors or in some cases your suppliers and others. So number two, it's your assets. That's what certainly helps your organization keep running, and whether they're static or mobile, again, you care about them. So number three, ultimately, it's your brand. Alan mentioned scrubbing social media. If all of a sudden 30% of all of the tweets about hashtag my company contain the word protest, I probably want to do something about it, because ultimately it may impact my employees and where they are if all of a sudden half the world is not happy with my company, with my brand. So that's number three. Number four, it could be my systems, right? It's my IT systems. If something goes down, slows down, disrupts my organization, I need to know. And then last but not least, it's my supply chain. Again, I might be fine, my supplier might be fine, but there's something bad, again, Irma, Harvey, Maria, Jose happening, and it's disrupting that connection in between the two. So on the one hand, I want to keep track of those 5 things, right? Hopefully starting with my people. On the other hand, I might need to know and get all of these information feeds that are coming in that may be able to tell me about things that might cause one of those 5 things to be impacted or to be in harm's way. So certainly social media feeds, situational awareness feeds, public safety feeds that may be coming in, and ultimately, as long as they're well structured and, as I had mentioned before, alluded to, they have the right vetting, the right tagging, the right classification. Tell me what category of an issue is this? Do I have a hazardous material spill, or is this a shooting, or is this a terrorist attack, or is this a weather pattern? Again, tell me the severity. How bad is it? The urgency. Is this something that's happening right now, or is this something that's happening 5 hours from now, and therefore I can take time to actually deal with the a plan A and a plan B? And then the certainty. Do I know for a fact that it's happening, or is this forecast to happen and it may or may not happen? So if I have that information coming in as part of these feeds, and I know where my people are or where my assets, at least the most critical ones of them are, I can keep an eye on my brand, my systems, and my supply routes. If any of these risk events will impact any of the things that I care about, then I know what to do, because hopefully I'll have a plan. And if not, I can get my incident response team or my major incident management team or my crisis management team together with the right information and follow up with the concrete steps.
Thank you, Imad, and thank you, Alan. So we're going to move on to, we're going to try and fit in 2 more questions before we conclude the webinar. So I'll start this off with Alan, if you want to kick this one off, and then we can move to the other 2 panelists. For urgent life safety incidents, what are some ways in which an organization can automate their response process to reduce risk, errors, and time?
Absolutely. So I guess from my perspective is it would be things like templating, checklists. Again, the processes first. I don't know, I'm going to make a plug for a book, but if you've ever had the opportunity to read Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, so he was a surgeon, and frankly talks about the value of checklists. So Checklist Manifesto, take a close look at that one. But from my perspective, that's the first piece is the process component. And then certainly from a technology perspective, whether it's location-based services, GPS, or the check-in feature, we use that very heavily here at Red Hat. In fact, we've had an 88% uptick in the last year of folks checking in as they're traveling from one location to another so they can be alerted prior to or in the event of a critical incident that may be occurring in the area that they're traveling in. So that emergency signaling and response and rescue, if you will, extraction, all of those things kind of bundle together. And we certainly use things like Wi-Fi or card access or visitor management. All of those linkages, I guess, for lack of a better term, allow us to both automate the process itself but also to use multifaceted components. So if you've ever run across the PACE approach, the primary, alternate, contingent, and emergency communication method. So, from our perspective, it's we look at what's the best and intended method of communications between parties, and that primary method, in many cases, at least from our perspective, is the Everbridge platform, and that's the solution that we rely on. But we also, because it's multimodal, we can use that for alternate, contingency, and even emergency communications as well. So from our perspective, how we communicate it is based on, again, templating and checklists and the response team leads, if you will, leveraging all of those to include the value of the line manager, I guess, if you will. So we're trying to further build the capabilities of our line managers for dashboards, for accountability, and making sure, since they are the ones that are closest to their associates, making sure that they're again, life safety has been established and they've been accounted for. But I think maybe from a thumbnail approach, that's what we look at. Process first, templating, checklists, et cetera. Second piece is leveraging those manager relationships, particularly the dashboards themselves. And the third piece is the technology component of trying to use that primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency communication to include that multimedia approach, multimodal approach that has allowed us to get a lot of uplift, for lack of a better term, in how our individual associates are leveraging things like associate check-ins as they're traveling from one location to another.
And let me add to that and also hopefully answer a question that came in via the Q&A window. When a situation that requires retention happens, again, some type of risk event that's affecting your people, your assets, etc. Part of what you want to do is understand as quickly as possible, again, the severity, the urgency, and so on and so forth of that risk event. But also what you need to do is fairly quickly locate your people. So do you have the appropriate information? And the ability to use multiple ways of understanding and being aware of where your people are is key. So do you have their static addresses, so home address, work address, to know whether they're going to be impacted or not? In addition to that, do you have, for example, an integrated approach towards understanding who is in the building? So, for example, we'll offer a physical access control integration with the profile that you may have in Everbridge, so we'll know who's in this building. Are you bringing in travel itineraries? I think one of you had asked about that in one of the Q&A windows, so that, again, if there is an issue in Barcelona or in London, I can tell very quickly not only who works there or who lives there, but also who's on their way there or who may have been on their way there over the last couple of weeks and therefore may still be there. So having this combination of static locations and dynamic locations that includes last known, or what we call expect location, where are people traveling, all in one place, can help with that response automation. And then having the appropriate templating in place. Look, do you have a process for active shooter or for a hazardous material spill or for a severe weather event or for a terrorist attack that allows the system to automatically trigger a variety of workflows, whether that's ensuring that you know who's part of the incident response team, whether it's regional or global or severe or can be just managed at the regional level. It can kick off the appropriate employee accountability processes that may or may not involve travelers and expats and local nationals. It may kick off the appropriate workflows for all the people who need to be on an FYI list. All of that can happen appropriately.
Thank you. And so we're going to move to our last question. So Steve, I'll have you open this question up. So this is our final discussion point. And well, what the last question is, how do you find the perfect balance or the appropriate balance between privacy and security?
Well, a lot of things affect that, Mike. There's a number of personal concerns. There's cultural aspects to that. And there's also, the situational component. And what I mean by that is if this is a psychological sort of answer about what we call recency bias. If there has recently been some sort of attack or storm or problem, people are usually willing to relax some of their privacy in the interest of heightened security. And as things go by, time goes by and things have been relatively safe or calm, they tend to pull that back and their interests tend to shift the other way, be more interested in privacy and less in security. So this is a dynamic sort of equation, and the balance is always changing. So my message to you and certainly the folks listening in on today's call is that there need to be mechanisms to be kind of monitoring and keeping your fingers on the pulse of that balance over time, and this should not be a static equation. When organizations come up with static scenario or solutions and say, this is our approach to striking the balance, they're going to be disappointed and they're going to be upsetting people pretty quickly because the balance point, the tipping point is always shifting. The fulcrum always is moving on that. And you need to be kind of looking at the risk climate. You need to be looking at different cultural factors, the age of those folks, their life history, and it's going to be very, very situationally driven. So my message to wrap that piece up is brilliant, statement. It all depends. It depends on all those factors, but everyone needs to know that it's dynamic and ever-changing, and there will never be a fixed point to find that balance.
Imad or Alan, do you have any final statements on this question?
This is Alan. Just very briefly. Yeah, very briefly. From our perspective, again, you think about us being an open decision-making framework kind of organization or open source software organization. We do a lot of opt-in, so allowing folks to choose to receive the information and explain the rationale or the why behind why they would like to do that. That's arguably the first piece. The second piece is things like the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that's getting ready to roll out from the EU's perspective in May of next year. I think that's certainly another driver from a regulatory or compliance perspective.
And I'll take that one step further, and one of the approaches we recommend is actually a double opt-in, that there are some policies and procedures, for example, that can be triggered in our system that do request location, for example. And if they don't, then the user of the system will not see that location. And as far as the employee is concerned, they will choose, especially when they're outside of a building, when and how their location information is used. And if it is, they will know about it. So that really can establish a certain trust that the information will only be used when needed, and then they can choose when to disclose it and when not to, and what will be done with it. So multiple levels of disclosure only when needed and when both parties need that level of information. That's how we believe you can strike the right balance, with the understanding that that balance may tilt in one direction or the other based on circumstances and based on culture.
All right. Thank you to our panel today. We appreciate all of you joining us as well in the audience. We apologize for going a little bit over, but at this time I'm going to hand it over to Claire.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to our panelists, Steve Cremando, Alan Borntrager, and Imad Moulin, as well as our sponsor, Everbridge. What a great discussion. Now, if you have any additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on that console. As you exit today's webinar, please take a couple minutes to complete our survey. We strongly welcome your detailed comments. Please visit securitymagazine.com for the archive of this presentation, as well as information about our upcoming events. We appreciate your time, and I hope you found this webinar to be a valuable experience. Thank you.